The scream cut through the afternoon air like a knife, sharp enough to make Mason Xavier's hand freeze halfway to his holster before he realized it was not a war cry but terror. He spurred his horse forward without thinking, mud from last night's storm spattering his worn leather chaps as he galloped toward the sound. What he found when he crested the small rise made his heart stop. A woman lay pinned beneath an overturned wagon, the massive wheel pressing her into the thick New Mexico mud, her face contorted in agony as she struggled to breathe under the weight. The horses that had been pulling the wagon were gone, their traces snapped and dangling uselessly from the harness, and the mud was so deep it seemed to be trying to swallow both her and the wagon whole. Mason threw himself from his horse before the animal even stopped moving, his boots hitting the ground with a wet squelch. He could see the woman's chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate gasps, her fingers clawing at the mud around her as if she could somehow pull herself free through sheer will. The wagon wheel had her pinned from the ribs down, and the angle told him that if he did not act fast, she would either suffocate or the pressure would cause damage he did not want to think about. "Hold on," he said, his voice rough but steady as he positioned himself beside the wagon. He could see her eyes now, wide and green as spring grass, fixed on him with a mixture of hope and fear that made something in his chest tighten. "I am going to lift this. When I do, you need to pull yourself out. Can you do that?" She nodded or tried to, the movement more of a twitch than anything else. Mason did not waste time with more words. He grabbed the wagon's edge, planted his feet as firmly as he could in the treacherous mud, and pulled. Nothing happened. The wagon was heavy even without its load, and the mud had created a seal that seemed determined to hold everything in place. He could feel the woman's eyes on him, could hear the way her breathing was getting worse, more labored. He adjusted his grip, his calloused hands finding better purchase on the weathered wood. Then he pulled again, this time with everything he had. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he heaved upward, his back straining, his legs shaking with the effort. The veins in his neck stood out like ropes, and sweat poured down his face despite the cool spring air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the wagon began to move. The wheel lifted an inch, then two, the mud releasing its hold with a sound like a giant's sucking breath. "Now," Mason grated out through clenched teeth, "move now." The woman did not hesitate. Despite her pain, despite the fear, she dug her elbows into the mud and dragged herself backward. Her dress was ruined, caked with mud and torn in places, but she moved with desperate determination. Mason held the wagon as long as he could, his entire body trembling with the strain, until he saw her legs clear the wheel. Then he let go, stumbling backward as the wagon crashed back down with a wet thud that sent mud flying in all directions. For a long moment, they both just lay there in the mud, gasping for breath. Mason could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, and his arms felt like they were made of lead. But he forced himself to move, crawling through the mud to where the woman lay on her back, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. "Are you hurt?" he asked, though he knew it was a stupid question. Of course she was hurt. The question was how badly. Her eyes opened, fixing on him with an intensity that made him catch his breath. "I think so," she whispered. "My legs. I cannot feel them properly." Mason felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, but he kept his face calm. "Let me look." He moved down to her legs, his hands gentle as he checked them over. She flinched when he touched her left leg, and he could see the beginnings of what would be spectacular bruising, but when he carefully moved each leg, checking for breaks, everything seemed intact. "I think you are just bruised. The feeling should come back once the shock wears off." She nodded, closing her eyes again. In the better light now that he was not frantically trying to save her life, Mason could see that she was young, probably around his own age of 24, with auburn hair that was trying to escape from a practical bun despite being caked with mud. Her face had good bones, strong and determined, though right now it was pale with shock and pain. "I am Mason," he said, because it seemed important to establish some normalcy after what had just happened. "Mason Xavier. I have a ranch about 5 miles from here." "Rebecca," she replied, her voice still weak but gaining strength. "Rebecca Kimball. I was traveling to Fort Sumner to meet my brother. He has a store there." Mason nodded. Fort Sumner was about 10 miles north of where they were now, a small but growing town in the New Mexico Territory. It was 1878, and the territory was still wild enough that a woman traveling alone was taking a serious risk, though he suspected she had not started out alone. "What happened to your horses?" he asked. Rebecca's face twisted with something that might have been anger or might have been grief. "There was a snake. It spooked them, and they bolted. I tried to hold them, but the reins were slippery from the mud, and the wagon hit a rut. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, and the wagon was on top of me. The horses broke free and ran off." She paused, then added with bitter humor, "I suppose I should be grateful they did not drag me with them." "Can you sit up?" Mason asked. When she nodded, he helped her, supporting her back as she struggled upright. She winced, her hand going to her ribs, and he saw her bite her lip against the pain. "We need to get you to Fort Sumner. Can you ride?" Rebecca looked at him, then at his horse, then back at him. "I do not think I have much choice, do I?" Mason could not help but crack a smile at that. "No, I suppose you do not." He stood, his legs still shaky from the effort of lifting the wagon, and offered her his hand. She took it, her fingers cold and muddy in his, and he pulled her to her feet. She swayed, and he caught her around the waist, holding her steady until she found her balance. "My things," she said, looking at the overturned wagon. "Everything I own is in there." Mason looked at the wagon half buried in the mud and made a quick decision. "I will come back for it with a team and a sled. Right now, getting you to a doctor is more important." She looked like she wanted to argue, but another wave of pain crossed her face and she nodded instead. Mason led her to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Chester who stood patiently despite the drama. Getting Rebecca into the saddle was a challenge, as every movement seemed to cause her pain, but finally she was settled, sitting sideways since her legs would not cooperate for a proper seat. Mason swung up behind her, one arm around her waist to hold her steady, and turned Chester toward Fort Sumner. The ride was slow and uncomfortable. Mason could feel every time Rebecca tensed with pain, could hear the little gasps she tried to suppress. He found himself holding her more carefully than he would have held a basket of eggs, trying to guide Chester around the worst of the bumps and ruts in the muddy road. She was warm against him despite her wet clothes, and he could smell the clean scent of her hair beneath the mud and sweat. It was strange, holding a woman he had just met, feeling responsible for her in a way that went beyond simple human decency. "Thank you," Rebecca said suddenly, her voice quiet but clear. "If you had not come along when you did, I would have died there." Mason felt his arm tighten around her waist involuntarily. "Anyone would have done the same? But you are the one who did it?" She turned her head slightly, enough that he could see her profile. "You could have hurt yourself lifting that wagon. It must have weighed hundreds of pounds." "I did not think about it," Mason admitted. "I just knew I had to get it off you." They fell into silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, broken only by the sound of Chester's hooves in the mud and the occasional call of a bird. The sun was starting to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink by the time the buildings of Fort Sumner came into view. Fort Sumner had started as a military fort, but after the Army abandoned it a few years back, civilians had moved in and established a town. It was still rough around the edges, the kind of place where a man kept his gun handy and his door locked, but it had the basics: a general store, a saloon, a church, and a doctor. Mason headed straight for the doctor's office, a small adobe building near the center of town. Dr. Harrison was a thin, nervous-looking man who had come west for his health and stayed because he found he liked the challenge of frontier medicine. He took one look at Rebecca and ushered them inside, directing Mason to lay her on the examination table. Mason started to leave to give her privacy, but Rebecca's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. "Stay," she said, and there was something in her eyes that made it impossible to refuse. So Mason stayed, standing awkwardly by the door while Dr. Harrison examined her. The doctor asked questions, prodding gently at her ribs and legs, checking her pupils and her pulse. Finally, he stepped back with a nod. "You are a very lucky young woman," he said. "Badly bruised, and you will be sore for a week or more, but nothing broken. The numbness in your legs should fade within a day or two as the swelling goes down. I will give you something for the pain, and you need to rest. No traveling, no heavy work, nothing that will strain those bruises." Rebecca nodded, but Mason could see the worry in her eyes. "My brother," she said, "Henry Kimball. He runs the general store. Can someone fetch him?" "I will go," Mason said immediately. He did not wait for Dr. Harrison to volunteer or for Rebecca to thank him. He just went back out into the cooling evening air and walked the 2 blocks to the general store. Henry Kimball turned out to be a tall, thin man with the same auburn hair as his sister, though his was receding from his forehead. When Mason explained what had happened, the color drained from Henry's face and he grabbed his coat without bothering to close up the store properly. They hurried back to the doctor's office together, Henry peppering Mason with questions the whole way. The reunion between brother and sister was emotional. Rebecca, who had held herself together so well during the whole ordeal, finally broke down and cried when she saw Henry. He held her carefully, mindful of her injuries, murmuring reassurances. Mason felt suddenly out of place, like he was intruding on something private. He started to slip out, but Henry caught his eye. "Wait," Henry said. He gently disentangled himself from his sister and came over to Mason, his hand extended. "I owe you more than I can ever repay. You saved my sister's life." Mason shook his hand, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "I did what anyone would do." "But you are the one who did it," Henry said, echoing Rebecca's earlier words. "Please let me at least buy you dinner." "It is the least I can do." Mason wanted to refuse, to go back to his ranch and his normal life, but something made him glance at Rebecca. She was watching him with those green eyes, and he found himself nodding. "All right. Dinner?" Henry insisted they go to the hotel restaurant, the nicest place in town. Rebecca had to stay at the doctor's office for a few more hours of observation, but she made them promise to bring her back something to eat. As Mason and Henry walked to the hotel, Henry told him about his sister. Rebecca had been living in Kansas City working as a teacher, but after their mother had died 6 months ago, she had decided to come west to be near her only family. She had sold everything she owned to make the trip, and everything she had left was in that overturned wagon. Henry's face was grim as he talked about it, and Mason could see the worry there. Replacing everything would be expensive, maybe more than either of them could afford. "I will get the wagon tomorrow," Mason promised, "and whatever can be saved, I will bring it back." Henry looked at him with something like wonder. "You have already done so much." Mason shrugged, feeling uncomfortable again. He was not used to being thanked so profusely. On a ranch, you did what needed doing and did not expect praise for it. But he could see that it mattered to Henry, so he accepted the thanks as gracefully as he could. They ate dinner, and Mason learned more about the Kimball family. Henry had come west 3 years ago, seeing opportunity in the growing town. He had built up a successful general store, supplying ranchers and townspeople alike with everything from flour to saddles. He had been trying to convince Rebecca to join him for over a year, and he was devastated that her arrival had nearly ended in tragedy. After dinner, they picked up food for Rebecca and brought it back to the doctor's office. She was looking better, some color back in her face, though she moved carefully. Dr. Harrison said she could go to Henry's house as long as she rested, so Mason helped Henry get her into a wagon Henry had borrowed from a neighbor. As they settled her in the back on a bed of blankets, Rebecca caught Mason's hand. "Will I see you again?" she asked, and there was something vulnerable in her voice that made his heart skip. "I am bringing your wagon tomorrow," he reminded her, "and I need to make sure you are healing properly." She smiled, a real smile that transformed her face. "Good." That night, lying in his bedroll at the small boarding house where he had decided to stay rather than ride home in the dark, Mason found himself unable to sleep. He kept seeing Rebecca's face, the fear in her eyes when she was trapped, the gratitude when he freed her, the smile when he promised to see her again. He had met plenty of women in his 24 years, had even courted a few, but none of them had affected him the way Rebecca Kimball did. There was something about her strength, the way she had held herself together even when she must have been terrified, that called to something deep inside him. The next morning, Mason rode out to the wagon at first light, bringing with him a team of horses and a sled he had rented from the livery. The mud had dried some overnight, making it easier to work, and he was able to right the wagon and hitch it to the team. Rebecca's belongings were scattered and muddy, but most of them seemed salvageable. There were trunks of clothes, boxes of books, a few pieces of furniture, and various personal items. Mason loaded everything carefully, treating each item as if it were precious, because he knew it was precious to her. It took him most of the day to get everything back to Fort Sumner. He brought it all to Henry's house, a neat adobe building behind the general store. Henry helped him unload, and together they carried everything inside. Rebecca was resting on a daybed in the parlor, her legs propped up on pillows, but she sat up when she saw them coming in with her things. "You saved it," she breathed, her eyes shining. "I thought it would all be ruined." "It needs cleaning," Mason said, setting down a trunk, "but it is all here." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears and she wiped them away impatiently. "I do not know how to thank you. You have done so much." Mason found himself crossing the room to her, kneeling down beside the daybed so they were at eye level. "You do not need to thank me. I am just glad you are all right." She reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle on his muddy cheek. "You are a good man, Mason Xavier." He felt heat rise in his face, but he did not pull away from her touch. "I should go. You need rest." "Will you come back?" she asked, and he heard the same vulnerability in her voice that he had heard the night before. "Yes," he promised, "I will come back." And he did. Over the next week, Mason found reasons to come to Fort Sumner almost every day. He needed supplies from Henry's store. He wanted to check on the wagon repairs. He had business in town that could not wait. The excuses were thin, and he suspected Henry saw right through them, but the other man never said anything. He just smiled and directed Mason to where Rebecca was resting. Rebecca healed quickly, her natural strength reasserting itself. Within a few days, she was moving around the house, though she still tired easily and had to rest often. Mason would sit with her during those rest periods, and they would talk. He learned that she loved books, that she had taught school for 5 years and missed it, that she was 23 years old and had never been married because she had been too busy taking care of their ailing mother. She learned that he had been ranching since he was 16, when his father died and left him the land, that he loved the wild beauty of New Mexico, that he had dreams of building something lasting. The more time Mason spent with Rebecca, the more he found himself thinking about her when they were apart. He would be mending a fence or checking on cattle and suddenly remember something she had said, the way she laughed, the intelligence in her eyes when they discussed some topic. It was getting harder to leave at the end of each visit, harder to say goodbye. One afternoon, about 10 days after the accident, Mason arrived to find Rebecca sitting on the small porch behind Henry's house, a book in her lap, her face turned up to the sun. She looked peaceful and beautiful, and something in his chest clenched at the sight of her. "Good afternoon," he said, and she turned to him with a smile that made him feel like the sun had just come out from behind a cloud. "Good afternoon, Mason. I was hoping you would come by today." He settled into the chair beside her, comfortable in the silence that fell between them. After a moment, Rebecca closed her book and set it aside. I have been thinking, she said, her voice careful. You have spent so much time coming to check on me, and you must be neglecting your ranch. I am well enough now that you do not need to worry. Mason felt his stomach drop. Was she telling him not to come back? He searched her face, trying to read her expression. Do you want me to stop coming? She looked startled. No, that is not what I meant at all. I just do not want to be a burden. You are not a burden, Mason said, and the intensity in his voice surprised even him. Rebecca, I come here because I want to, because I think about you all the time when I'm not here, because these past 10 days have been the best I have had in longer than I can remember. Rebecca's eyes widened, and a flush rose in her cheeks. Mason, I think about you too, all the time. When I wake up, I wonder when I will see you. When you leave, I count the hours until you might come back. I thought I was being foolish, that you were just being kind because you saved my life. Mason reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle on her smooth skin. I am not being kind. I am being selfish. I want to spend time with you because being with you makes me happy in a way I have never felt before. She turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. What are we going to do about this? I do not know, Mason admitted. All I know is that I do not want to stop seeing you. Neither do I, Rebecca said softly. They sat there, hands linked, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. It felt like a turning point, like something important had just been decided even though they had not made any concrete plans. When Mason finally left that evening, Rebecca walked him to the door, and he found himself not wanting to let go of her hand. Tomorrow? He asked. Tomorrow, she confirmed. That night, Mason lay in his own bed at his ranch, staring at the ceiling. He had lived alone since his father died, managing the ranch with the help of a few hired hands. It was a good life, but a lonely one. He had not realized how lonely until he met Rebecca. Now the house felt too empty, too quiet. He found himself imagining what it would be like if she were there, if he came in from a day's work to find her waiting, if they ate dinner together and talked about their days, if they went to bed together and woke up in each other's arms. The thoughts should have scared him. They had only known each other for a week and a half, but instead of fear, he felt a deep certainty. Rebecca Kimball was the woman he had been waiting for his whole life, and he was not going to let her go. Over the next few weeks, Mason courted Rebecca properly. He brought her flowers from the meadow near his ranch. He took her for slow walks around Fort Sumner as her strength returned. He introduced her to his few close friends in the area, and he talked to Henry, man to man, about his intentions. Henry had been expecting the conversation. He looked at Mason across the counter of his store and nodded slowly. I have seen the way you two look at each other, and I have seen the kind of man you are, Mason. You saved my sister's life, and you have treated her with nothing but respect and kindness. If she wants you, then you have my blessing. I have not asked her yet, Mason admitted. But you are going to, Henry said. It was not a question. Yes, if you think she might say yes, Henry laughed. I think she will say yes before you finish asking. Encouraged, Mason planned carefully. He wanted to do this right, to give Rebecca a proposal she would remember for the rest of her life. He decided to take her to his ranch, to show her the place that meant so much to him, the place he hoped would become her home. It was a beautiful spring morning when he picked her up in his wagon. Rebecca was wearing a green dress that matched her eyes, her hair arranged in a becoming style that showed she had taken care with her appearance. Mason felt his mouth go dry at the sight of her. You look beautiful, he managed to say. She blushed, pleased. Thank you. Where are we going? My ranch. I want to show you where I live. The ride took about an hour, and they talked the whole way, comfortable with each other in a way that felt like they had known each other for years rather than weeks. When they crested the final rise and Mason's ranch came into view, he watched Rebecca's face carefully. The ranch house was modest but well built, with a wide porch that caught the afternoon breeze. Around it were corrals, a barn, and various outbuildings. In the distance, Mason's cattle grazed on the spring green grass. Mountains rose in the far distance, purple against the blue sky. "Oh, Mason," Rebecca breathed, "it is beautiful." Pride warmed him. He had worked hard to build this place up, to make it something he could be proud of. "Let me show you around." He took her through the house, pointing out the different rooms, the improvements he had made. Rebecca asked intelligent questions, and he could see her imagining herself there. When they came to the master bedroom, he hesitated, but she walked in without shyness, looking around at the simple furniture, the window that looked out over the mountains. "The sunrise must be beautiful from here," she said. "It is," Mason confirmed. "Every morning I wake up and look out that window and feel grateful for what I have." She turned to him, her eyes serious. "You have built something wonderful here, Mason." "I want to build more," he said, his heart pounding. "I want to build a family, a life, with you." Rebecca's breath caught. "Mason, what are you saying?" He took her hands in his, holding them carefully. "I am saying that I love you, Rebecca Kimball. I have loved you since the moment I saw you trapped under that wagon, so fierce and brave and determined to survive. I love your strength and your intelligence and the way you make me laugh. I love how you see the good in everything, how you are not afraid of hard work, how you fit into my life like you were always meant to be there. I know we have not known each other long, but I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Rebecca, will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Rebecca's face, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Mason, I will marry you. I love you too. I think I started loving you when you were lifting that wagon, when I saw how much you were willing to give to save a stranger. And then I got to know you, and I fell even deeper in love with your kindness and your humor and the way you make me feel safe and cherished. Yes, I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you here on this beautiful ranch." Mason pulled her into his arms, holding her close, feeling her heart beat against his. Then he tilted her face up and kissed her for the first time. Her lips were soft and warm, and she kissed him back with a passion that made his head spin. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I wish I had a ring for you," he said regretfully. Rebecca laughed, the sound joyous. "I do not need a ring right now. We can get one later. All I need is you." They stayed at the ranch for the rest of the day, making plans, talking about the future. Rebecca wanted to continue teaching, perhaps starting a school in Fort Sumner. Mason was supportive, eager to see her do something she loved. They talked about children, about how they would raise them, about the values they would teach. They talked about growing the ranch, about building a legacy. When Mason finally took Rebecca back to Henry's house that evening, they were both giddy with happiness. Henry took one look at their joined hands and their glowing faces and broke into a wide grin. "I am guessing congratulations are in order?" She said yes, Mason confirmed, unable to keep the pride and joy out of his voice. Henry pulled Rebecca into a hug, then shook Mason's hand warmly. "Welcome to the family, Mason. I cannot think of anyone I would rather have as a brother." They decided on a short engagement. There seemed no reason to wait when they were both certain of what they wanted. Rebecca threw herself into wedding preparations with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else. She sewed her own dress, a beautiful creation of ivory silk that Henry ordered special from back east. She planned the ceremony and the small reception that would follow. She made lists and checked things off with satisfaction. Mason, meanwhile, worked on the house, making improvements and additions. He added a room that could serve as Rebecca's study, with shelves for her books and a large window for light. He bought new furniture, wanting everything to be perfect for his bride. He painted and repaired and polished until the house shone. The wedding took place 6 weeks after Mason's proposal, on a warm day in late June. The ceremony was held in the small church in Fort Sumner, with about 30 guests in attendance. Rebecca looked radiant in her ivory dress, her auburn hair crowned with wildflowers. Mason wore his best suit, though he felt awkward in it, more comfortable in his working clothes. But when Rebecca walked down the aisle on Henry's arm and smiled at him, he forgot about his discomfort. He forgot about everything except her. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but Mason meant every word with an intensity that shook him. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death parted them. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and told Mason he could kiss his bride, Mason did so tenderly, aware of all the eyes on them, but not caring. Rebecca was his wife now, and he was her husband, and nothing else mattered. The reception was held at the hotel, with food and music and dancing. Mason was not much of a dancer, but Rebecca taught him, laughing as he stepped on her toes. They cut the cake together, fed each other bites, and accepted the good wishes of their friends and neighbors. Henry gave a toast that had everyone laughing and Rebecca crying happy tears. As the sun began to set, Mason and Rebecca slipped away from the party and climbed into Mason's wagon for the ride out to the ranch. Their ranch now, Mason corrected himself. Rebecca sat close to him, her head on his shoulder, and they drove in contented silence through the gathering dusk. The house was waiting for them, lamplight glowing in the windows. Mason had arranged for one of his hands to light the lamps and lay a fire in the bedroom fireplace before the wedding. He helped Rebecca down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her up into his arms and carrying her across the threshold. She laughed and wrapped her arms around his neck, her eyes shining. "Welcome home, Mrs. Xavier," Mason said softly. "I love the sound of that," Rebecca replied. He carried her through to the bedroom and set her down gently. For a moment they just looked at each other, the weight of what they were about to share settling over them. Mason had been with women before, but never like this, never with someone he loved so deeply. He could see the same mixture of nervousness and anticipation in Rebecca's eyes. "We do not have to hurry," he said gently. "We have the rest of our lives." Rebecca reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I know, but I want this, Mason. I want you. I want to be your wife in every way." He kissed her then, slow and deep, pouring all his love and desire into it. She responded with equal passion, her hands moving to the buttons of his shirt. They undressed each other slowly, learning each other's bodies, taking their time. When they finally came together, it was with tenderness and love, a joining that felt sacred. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the big bed, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. Mason held Rebecca close, her head on his chest, his hand stroking her hair. He felt complete in a way he never had before, like a piece of himself he had not known was missing had finally been found. "I love you," Rebecca murmured sleepily. "I love you too," Mason replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Sleep now, my love." She drifted off in his arms, her breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of sleep. Mason lay awake a while longer, looking out the window at the stars scattered across the vast New Mexico sky, marveling at how his life had changed. A little over 2 months ago, he had been alone, going through the motions of life without really living. Now he had Rebecca, and everything felt different. The future stretched out before them, full of possibility and promise. The first few months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Rebecca was used to living with her brother, to having her own space and her own routines. Mason was used to living alone, to doing things his own way without having to consult anyone. But they worked through the inevitable small conflicts with patience and humor, learning to compromise, learning to communicate. Rebecca started a school in Fort Sumner, teaching children in a room Henry let her use above the general store. She loved it. Loved seeing the children learn and grow, loved feeling like she was contributing to the community. Mason loved seeing her so happy, loved hearing her talk excitedly about her students' progress, The ranch prospered under Mason's careful management. He bought more cattle, improved his breeding stock, and built a reputation for honest dealing that brought him steady business. Rebecca helped with the books, her neat handwriting filling the ledgers, her mathematical mind catching errors and spotting opportunities Mason might have missed. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, working during the day and coming together at night. Mason never got tired of coming home to find Rebecca waiting, never got tired of the way she smiled when she saw him, never got tired of holding her as they fell asleep. They talked about everything and nothing, shared their hopes and fears, supported each other through challenges, and celebrated each other's successes. About a year into their marriage, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant. She told Mason one evening after dinner, her face glowing with excitement and nervousness. Mason felt his knees go weak with joy and terror. A baby. They were going to have a baby. "Are you happy?" Rebecca asked anxiously. Mason pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully, as if she might break. "I am more than happy. I am thrilled, terrified but thrilled." Rebecca laughed, relaxing against him. "I am terrified too, but I think we will figure it out together." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Rebecca had bouts of morning sickness that left her pale and exhausted. Mason hovered anxiously, driving her crazy with his concern, until she finally sat him down and told him firmly that she was not made of glass and he needed to let her live her life. He tried to back off, though it was hard when all he wanted was to wrap her in cotton wool and keep her safe. Rebecca continued teaching until she was 7 months along, then reluctantly handed her students over to a young woman who had recently arrived in town looking for work. She spent the last 2 months of her pregnancy preparing the nursery, sewing tiny clothes, and reading every book on childbirth and child rearing she could get her hands on. Mason, meanwhile, threw himself into preparing for fatherhood. He built a cradle out of smooth pine, sanding it until there was not a single rough spot that might scratch delicate baby skin. He installed shutters on the nursery window to keep out drafts. He stocked up on supplies, buying everything Henry suggested and probably a lot of things they did not need. When Rebecca's time came on a cold January night in 1880, Mason was nowhere near as prepared as he thought he was. The local midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen, arrived and took charge, sending Mason out of the bedroom with firm instructions not to come back until he was called. He paced the parlor, listening to the sounds coming from the bedroom, feeling helpless and scared in a way he had not felt since the day he found Rebecca trapped under the wagon. It was a long night. Every cry from Rebecca tore at Mason's heart, made him want to break down the bedroom door and do something, anything to help her. Henry had come to stay with him, and he sat in a chair by the fire, occasionally offering words of comfort that Mason barely heard. Finally, as the sun was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, Mason heard a new sound, a baby's cry, thin and indignant and absolutely beautiful. He was on his feet immediately, and a moment later Mrs. Chen opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Xavier, a healthy boy, and your wife is doing well." Mason pushed past her into the bedroom. Rebecca was propped up against the pillows, exhausted and pale, but glowing with joy. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. Mason approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus on this new, bright world. He was the most beautiful thing Mason had ever seen, except for Rebecca. "Do you want to hold him?" Rebecca asked softly. Mason nodded, not trusting his voice. Rebecca carefully transferred the baby into his arms, and Mason looked down at his son, feeling his entire world shift and reform around this tiny person. He was a father. He had a son. The weight of responsibility was staggering, but so was the love that flooded through him. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I am your papa, and I promise you, I am going to do everything in my power to give you a good life, to keep you safe and happy and loved." "What should we name him?" Rebecca asked. They had discussed names, but somehow none of their ideas seemed right now that the baby was actually here. Mason looked at his son, at the determined set of his tiny jaw even in sleep, and smiled. "What about Matthew? Matthew Xavier?" Rebecca's face lit up. "Matthew, I love it. Hello, Matthew." "Baby." Matthew Xavier squirmed in his father's arms and made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been gas, but it did not matter. He was here, he was healthy, and he was theirs. The first few months of parenthood were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Matthew was a good baby for the most part, but he still needed to be fed every few hours. His diapers changed constantly, and his mysterious bouts of crying soothed. Mason and Rebecca took turns getting up with him at night, though Mason insisted on doing more than his share, knowing that Rebecca was still recovering from the birth. Mason discovered that he loved being a father. He loved holding Matthew, loved watching him sleep, loved seeing him discover the world. He would carry the baby out to the barn and show him the horses, talking to him in a soft voice about everything and nothing. Rebecca would find them there, Mason holding Matthew in one arm while he worked with the other, the baby watching his father with solemn eyes. As Matthew grew, he developed a personality that was equal parts both his parents. He had Rebecca's intelligence and determination, but also Mason's calm steadiness. He was a happy child, quick to smile and laugh, and both his parents doted on him shamelessly. When Matthew was 2 years old, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first, with more sickness and more fatigue. Mason worried constantly, but Rebecca assured him that the doctor said everything was fine. She was just older now, and her body was working harder. Their second child, a daughter they named Ruth, was born on a warm spring day in 1882. She came into the world screaming her displeasure at the indignity of birth, and she did not stop screaming for what felt like hours. Matthew, who had been excited about becoming a big brother, stared at his new sister in dismay. "Is she always going to be that loud?" he asked. Mason, who was wondering the same thing, ruffled his son's hair. "I hope not, buddy." Ruth turned out to be a more challenging baby than Matthew had been. She had strong opinions about everything and was not shy about expressing them. She wanted to be held constantly, screamed if put down, and seemed to sleep only when it was least convenient for everyone else. Rebecca, exhausted and overwhelmed, sometimes cried along with the baby. Mason did his best to help, taking over as much of the ranch work as he could manage alone and hiring extra help when he could not. He walked the floor with Ruth at night, letting Rebecca sleep, bouncing the baby, and singing to her in his rough voice until she finally quieted. He entertained Matthew, who was feeling neglected with all the attention on his noisy sister, taking him on small adventures around the ranch. Gradually, as Ruth grew, she became easier. She was still opinionated and strong-willed, but she also developed a sunny personality that made it hard to stay mad at her. She adored her big brother, following him around as soon as she could walk. And Matthew, after getting over his initial disappointment, became fiercely protective of his little sister. The years passed in a blur of children and work and love. Mason and Rebecca grew into their roles as parents and partners, supporting each other through the challenges and celebrating the joys. The ranch continued to prosper, allowing them to expand the house and improve their land. Rebecca went back to teaching part-time, leaving the children with a trusted neighbor. Matthew grew into a serious boy who loved learning and reading, his nose always in a book when he was not helping his father with the ranch. Ruth was all energy and enthusiasm, always getting into things, always asking questions, always pushing boundaries. They fought the way siblings do, but they also loved each other fiercely. When Matthew was 8 and Ruth was 6, Rebecca sat Mason down one evening and told him she was pregnant again. Mason's reaction was complicated. They had 2 healthy, wonderful children. They were getting older. Rebecca was 31 and he was 32. Was it wise to have another baby? But when he looked at Rebecca's face, saw the hope and fear there, he pushed his doubts aside and pulled her into his arms. "We will manage," he said firmly. "We always do." This pregnancy was the hardest yet. Rebecca was sick the entire time. So weak she could barely get out of bed some days. Mason hired a woman from town to help with the children in the house, and he tried to take over as much of Rebecca's usual work as he could. He was terrified, remembering all the stories he had heard of women who did not survive childbirth, of pregnancies that went wrong. But Rebecca was strong. She had always been strong, from the day he met her trapped under that wagon wheel. And when her time came on a snowy December day in 1884, she faced it with the same courage she faced everything. Their third child was another boy, smaller than the others had been, but healthy and vocal. They named him Marcus, and from the moment Mason held him, he felt the same overwhelming love he had felt with the other two. This tiny person, so vulnerable and dependent, was his son, his responsibility, his joy. Marcus was a surprise in every way. Where Matthew was serious and Ruth was energetic, Marcus was contemplative. He was a quiet baby who watched everything with wide, thoughtful eyes. As he grew, he proved to be the peacemaker among the siblings, somehow able to calm Ruth's temper tantrums and coax Matthew out of his books. With 3 children, the house was always full of noise and activity. Mason built an addition, adding 2 more bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. Rebecca organized everyone with the same efficiency she brought to teaching, creating schedules and routines that kept the household running smoothly. It was chaotic and exhausting and absolutely wonderful. Mason would sometimes stand on his porch in the evening watching his children play in the yard while Rebecca sat in her rocking chair mending or reading, and feel a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what he had dreamed of when he was younger and alone. This family, this home, this life. And it was better than anything he could have imagined. As the children grew older, they each took on responsibilities around the ranch. Matthew, at 10, was already a skilled rider and helped move the cattle. Ruth, at 8, took charge of the chickens and the vegetable garden, bossing everyone around with cheerful authority. Marcus, at 4, followed whoever would let him, asking endless questions and absorbing information like a sponge. Rebecca continued teaching, now running a proper school in a building the town had constructed. She was respected in the community, known for her dedication to her students and her intelligence. Mason was proud of her, proud that she had not given up her own dreams and ambitions even while raising their family. The years continued to pass. The children grew. The ranch prospered, and Mason and Rebecca's love deepened. They had their challenges, of course. There were droughts that threatened the cattle, illnesses that scared them, financial setbacks that required tightening belts. But they faced everything together, partners in the truest sense. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Mason took Rebecca back to the spot where he had first found her, trapped under the wagon wheel. The road was different now, improved and maintained, but they could still identify the general location. They stood there hand in hand, remembering that day that had changed both their lives. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you had not come along," Rebecca said quietly. "If you had taken a different route, or been delayed, or any of 100 things that could have kept you from finding me." Mason tightened his hand around hers. "I try not to think about that. It is too terrible." "But you did come along," Rebecca continued. "You saved me, and then you loved me, and you gave me this wonderful life. 3 beautiful children, a home I adore, work that fulfills me, and a husband who still makes my heart race when he walks into a room." Mason turned to her, seeing the girl she had been under the mature woman she had become. The years had added fine lines around her eyes and a few threads of silver in her auburn hair. But to him she was as beautiful as the day he married her. More beautiful, because now he knew her completely. Every facet of her personality, every mood and quirk and preference. "You make my heart race too," he said. "Every single day. I love you more now than I did when we married, and I thought that was impossible." Rebecca reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "We were so lucky, Mason, to find each other the way we did, to build what we have built. Not everyone gets this. I know, Mason said, and he did. He had seen too many loveless marriages, too many people who settled for companionship without passion, partnership without love. He and Rebecca had both, and he thanked God for it every day. They kissed there on the roadside, a long, sweet kiss that reminded them of their wedding day and of every day since. When they broke apart, they were both smiling. The children grew into young adults, each finding their own path. Matthew, at 16, was already working the ranch alongside his father, tall and capable and serious. He talked about going to agricultural college, about learning new techniques for ranching and farming. Mason encouraged him, wanting his son to have every opportunity. Ruth, at 14, was a whirlwind of energy and ambition. She helped her mother at the school, but dreamed of seeing more of the world, of traveling to the cities back east, maybe even to Europe. Rebecca saw herself in Ruth, the same desire to experience life beyond the boundaries of home. Marcus, at 10, was still the quiet observer, but he had developed a gift for working with animals. He could calm the wildest horse, convince the most stubborn cow to cooperate. Mason watched him work with wonder, seeing a skill that was part knowledge and part something indefinable. As the 20th century approached, the world was changing. The Wild West that Mason had grown up in was being tamed. Railroads connecting isolated communities, telegraph lines bringing news from across the country. New Mexico was moving towards statehood, and Fort Sumner was growing from a rough frontier town into a proper community. Mason and Rebecca grew older along with the century. His back sometimes ached from old injuries, and her hands were not as steady as they once were. But they were still strong, still vital, still in love. On a warm evening in the spring of 1895, they sat on their porch watching the sunset, as they had done countless times over the years. Matthew was out checking on the cattle with a few ranch hands. Ruth was at a friend's house planning some adventure. Marcus was in the barn working with a new foal. They were alone, a rare occurrence these days. "Do you remember that first day?" Rebecca asked, "when you pulled the wagon off me?" "Every detail," Mason replied. "I remember the fear in your eyes and the determination. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever seen." "I remember thinking you were the strongest," Rebecca said with a smile. "And then I got to know you, and I learned you were not just strong in body but in character. You saved my life that day, Mason, but you also gave me a life worth living." Mason took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles in a familiar gesture. "We gave each other that, I think. I was just existing before I met you, going through the motions. You made me want to really live." They sat in companionable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. In the distance, they could hear Marcus singing to the horses, his young voice carrying on the evening breeze. "We did well, did we not?" Rebecca said softly. "With the children, with the ranch, with our life together." "We did very well," Mason agreed. "Better than I ever hoped." Rebecca leaned her head on his shoulder. "I want you to know, Mason Xavier, that if I could go back and live my life again, I would not change a single thing. Not the accident, not the pain, not the struggles, because it all led me to you, to this life we have built together." Mason felt his throat tighten with emotion. After 17 years of marriage, she could still make him feel like the luckiest man alive. "I feel the same way. Everything I have, everything I am, is because you came into my life and made me better." They watched the last of the sunset fade, the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. From somewhere in the house, they heard the clock strike the hour, a peaceful domestic sound. Soon the children would come home. The house would fill with noise and activity, and the evening routine would begin. But for now, it was just the two of them, together as they had been since that muddy spring day in 1878, when Mason Xavier had lifted a wagon wheel with everything he had and found love beneath it. "Tell me," Rebecca said, "what do you want for the next 17 years?" Mason thought about it. More of this, more sunsets with you, more watching our children grow and succeed, more of building our life together, maybe grandchildren someday. Rebecca laughed. I think Ruth is too young for that yet, and the boys are nowhere near thinking about marriage. Someday, Mason repeated. I want to grow old with you, Rebecca. I want to still be sitting on this porch in 20 years holding your hand and remembering all the adventures we have had. Adventures, Rebecca mused. Is that what we call them? What else? Mason asked. Every day with you is an adventure. They sat until the stars filled the sky, talking quietly about their hopes and dreams, their memories and plans. When they finally went inside, it was with their arms around each other, moving in the easy synchrony of two people who had learned to walk through life as one. The years that followed held both joys and sorrows, as life always does. There were weddings to celebrate when the children grew up and found partners of their own. Matthew married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, a sensible woman who shared his love of the land. Ruth surprised everyone by falling in love with a teacher who had come from Boston, and they moved back east, though she wrote long letters full of her adventures. Marcus eventually married a girl from Fort Sumner, someone he had known since childhood, and they built a house on a corner of the ranch that Mason deeded to them. There were grandchildren, 7 in all, who filled the house with noise and laughter during visits. Mason loved being a grandfather, loved spoiling the children in ways he had not allowed himself to spoil his own. Rebecca baked cookies and told stories and taught them to read, her face glowing with joy whenever they visited. There were also losses. Henry Kimball died in 1903, and Rebecca grieved deeply for the brother who had been her anchor when she first came west. Some of their old friends passed on as well, the generation that had built the territory giving way to the next. Mason's hair went completely gray, and Rebecca's hands developed arthritis that made her beautiful handwriting shaky. But they still had each other, and that made everything bearable. In 1908, on their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party. It was held at the ranch house, now expanded and remodeled multiple times over the years. All 7 grandchildren were there, along with Matthew and his wife, Marcus and his wife, Ruth, and her husband, who had made the long journey from Boston. Friends and neighbors from Fort Sumner filled the house and yard, celebrating the couple who had become pillars of the community. When it was time for toasts, Matthew stood up, his face serious as always, but his eyes warm. I want to thank my parents, he said, for showing us all what love looks like. I grew up watching them work together, support each other, and love each other through good times and bad. They taught me that marriage is not just about the big romantic gestures, though my father certainly had those. Ruth was next, her toast full of humor and affection. I remember when I was little thinking my parents were so boring because they were always together, always talking, always in love. I wanted adventure and excitement. But now I understand that what they have is the greatest adventure of all. 30 years of building a life together, raising a family, creating something that will last long after they are gone. That is not boring. That is extraordinary. Marcus kept his toast simple, as was his way. You taught me that love is patient and kind, that it is action, not just words, that it means being willing to lift the weight off someone else's shoulders even when it is hard. Thank you for that. When they were finally alone that night, exhausted but happy, Mason and Rebecca sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. The party had been wonderful, but this quiet moment together was better. 30 years, Rebecca said wonderingly. It seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. I know exactly what you mean, Mason replied. He looked at her in the moonlight, seeing both the young woman he had pulled from beneath the wagon and the woman she had become. I would do it all again, Rebecca, every single moment. Even the hard parts? She asked. Especially the hard parts, Mason said, because they are part of our story. They made us who we are. Rebecca smiled, the expression lighting up her face despite the lines in the gray hair. I love you, Mason Xavier. I have loved you for 30 years, and I will love you for as many more as we are granted. And I love you, Rebecca Xavier. You are my life, my heart, my everything. They kissed beneath the stars, a gentle kiss that held 3 decades of love and partnership. When they finally went to bed, it was hand in hand, still together, still in love, still grateful for the day a wagon wheel had trapped a woman in the mud and a cowboy had lifted it with everything he had. The years continued their steady march. Mason and Rebecca grew older, their steps slower, but their love undiminished. They watched their grandchildren grow, saw some of them marry and start families of their own. They saw New Mexico become a state in 1912, the culmination of decades of hope and work. They adapted to new technologies, from automobiles to telephones, though Mason never quite trusted either one. When Mason was 70 and Rebecca was 69, he woke one morning to find her watching him with a tender expression. "What?" he asked, still half asleep. "I was just thinking," she said, "about how lucky I am. To have had all these years with you, to have built this life, to have loved and been loved so completely." Mason reached for her hand, holding it as he had held it countless times over their 40 years of marriage. "The luck was mine. I was just a lonely rancher before you came along. You made me whole." "We made each other whole," Rebecca corrected gently. They spent that day together doing simple things. They walked slowly around the ranch, Mason pointing out all the changes and improvements that had been made over the decades. They had lunch with Marcus and his family, laughing at the antics of their great-grandchildren. They sat on the porch in the afternoon, reading and talking and simply being together. That night, Rebecca fell asleep in Mason's arms, peaceful and content. She did not wake up. The doctor said later that her heart had simply stopped, worn out after 69 years of beating. She had died peacefully, without pain, surrounded by love. Mason was shattered. After 40 years of rarely being apart, of facing everything together, he was alone. The grief was overwhelming, threatening to drown him. But he had his children and grandchildren, and they rallied around him, holding him up when he could not stand on his own. At Rebecca's funeral, the church was packed. She had touched so many lives through her teaching, her kindness, her friendship. Person after person stood up to talk about what she had meant to them, how she had changed their lives. Mason listened, proud and heartbroken in equal measure. When it was his turn to speak, he stood at the front of the church and looked out at all the faces. "Rebecca was my wife for 40 years, he said, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. But she was more than that. She was my partner, my best friend, my reason for getting up in the morning. She was the bravest person I ever knew. From the day I met her when she was trapped and injured but still fighting, she never stopped fighting, never stopped trying to make the world better. She loved fiercely, taught passionately, and lived fully, and she made me a better man, just by being in my life. I will miss her every day for the rest of my life, but I am grateful for every moment we had together." He sat down, and Matthew put an arm around him, holding him as Mason had held him when he was a child. Marcus sat on his other side, and though Ruth could not be there, having been too ill to travel from Boston, Mason felt her presence anyway. His family, the legacy he and Rebecca had built together. Mason lived for 3 more years after Rebecca died. They were not easy years. He missed her constantly, found himself turning to speak to her, only to remember she was gone. But he also found comfort in the memories, in the life they had built, in the family that surrounded him. He spent time with his children and grandchildren, telling them stories about Rebecca, making sure they remembered her strength and love and intelligence. He still walked out to the road sometimes, to the place where he had found her all those years ago. He would stand there, remembering that day, marveling at how one moment could change everything. If he had ridden past, if he had not heard her scream, if he had not been strong enough to lift the wagon. So many ifs, but none of them had happened. He had found her, saved her, loved her, and built a life with her that had been richer and more fulfilling than anything he could have imagined. Mason Xavier died peacefully in his sleep in 1920, at the age of 73. His children buried him next to Rebecca, their graves side by side as they had been side by side in life. On the stone, they inscribed both names and dates, and beneath them, a simple phrase, "Together always." The ranch passed to Matthew and Marcus, who ran it together, honoring their father's legacy. Ruth eventually returned to New Mexico, wanting to be near her family in her later years. The grandchildren grew up hearing stories about Mason and Rebecca, about the day they met, about the life they built together, and in Fort Sumner, which had grown from a rough frontier town into a proper city, people still told the story. About the cowboy who had pulled a wagon off a trapped woman, about how they had fallen in love, about the family they had raised and the life they had lived. It became a legend of sorts, a reminder that even in the hardest circumstances, even in the wild and dangerous West, love could flourish. That one moment of courage and compassion could change lives forever. The house Mason had built, expanded and improved over the years, still stood on the ranch. His great-great-grandchildren played there, running through the rooms where he and Rebecca had raised their family, sitting on the porch where they had watched so many sunsets together. The land he had worked so hard to improve continued to prosper, supporting generation after generation. And somewhere beyond the veil, in whatever comes after this life, Mason and Rebecca were together again, hand in hand, hearts joined as they always had been. The cowboy who had lifted a wagon with everything he had, and the woman who had been brave enough to survive and strong enough to love completely, reunited at last in a place where there was no more pain, no more parting, only the eternal joy of love that had conquered time, distance, and even death itself. Their story lived on, passed down through the generations, a testament to the power of a single act of courage and the transformative nature of love. In the end, that was their true legacy, more valuable than land or wealth or even the strong family they had raised. They had shown that love, real love, the kind that lifts impossible weights and conquers seemingly insurmountable obstacles, was worth everything. That it could take two strangers brought together by chance and desperation and forge them into partners who would face the world together, building something beautiful and lasting. And every spring, when the rains came to New Mexico and the roads turned to mud, someone in the family would tell the story again. About the day Rebecca Kimball was trapped under a wagon wheel in the mud, and Mason Xavier lifted it with everything he had, and in doing so lifted both their lives into something neither could have achieved alone. It was a story of the Wild West, of courage and determination, but most of all it was a love story, the kind that transcends time and touches everyone who hears it, reminding them that love, real and true and lasting, is always worth fighting for,